what is the most awesome theater moment you've had? Not like the biggest shows you've been in or the biggest audience you played to or the best tickets you ever had. Those are important. I want you to think about awesome. The time where you were like in Times Square on the way to a show, you stopped to take a picture with Elmo and you got photobombed by Patrick Stewart. Or the time you were at the production of In the Heights and right before the blackout scene, the power really did go out. Or you were on stage with your fellow performer and they forgot all their lines and you successfully improv'd Weird Al Yankovich lyrics for 5 minutes. What I mean is awesome. Today's guest is Emily Clark, and she'd have a tough time answering that question because her life and she are awesome. But for my money, it was this.
It was a thing where Victor and I were always like, okay, we got to do Bigfoot at the Fringe eventually, and we have to do it. As Amber was getting more and more famous and more Broadway work, we were like, okay, we have to do this soon because there's no way. So we literally just like called her up and messaged her and we're like, can we do Bigfoot? And she said, yeah, go for it. So we did. And it went really well. It's a hilarious show. We had a really great cast. And it was by far our most successful thing we've done at Fringe.
She was in Bigfoot, the musical. That's like 11 out of 10 on the awesome scale. And it's obviously a tongue-in-cheek show, but it works as comedy, has great music, and according to Emily, it's about to open off-Broadway. Definitely won the 2024 Best of Fringe Award, but more than any of that, it is awesome. Today we are going to meet performer, educator, tounge-in Bigfoot, and Cal State Fullerton Master's candidate Emily Clark, who's going to share with us her research about The Secret Garden, which is, of course, a beloved children's book and was a Broadway musical that had 7 Tony nominations and 3 wins in 1991, and it was one of the first ever shows with an all-female production team. We'll cover all that ground and get to meet Emily, but first, let's run the intro. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and do a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I'll never miss any opportunity to pursue a mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Thank you, as always, for listening, and please share this episode and this show if you find it entertaining and informative. We have the deepest dives into musical theater productions anywhere on the internet, and if you're into backstories and serious research behind great productions, we are the show for you. This show can keep happening as long as we've got an audience. The best advertising any podcast can have is the word of mouth. I know that sometimes it's actually easier to throw a small donation at something you want to support than post about it. But the best thing you can do to help this show is to drop the link on social media or tell a friend, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate those of you who have already done that. Okay, just a little bit of academic background context here. You can, of course, earn a 2-year degree at a community college and then a 4-year degree at university, and both of those are designed to give you competence in some field or profession. But the next step is to get a research degree where you don't just read the work that others have been doing, but you actually contribute to a body of knowledge. The last step, of course, is a PhD. Most research in published academic journals with titles like Western Journal of Communication or Media Studies Research or Studies in Musical Theater or places like that. That's where the stuff gets published. But the very first step on that journey is finishing your master's thesis, which is an original project, usually hundreds of pages long, where you have to go out and find an area that has not got a ton of research done on it, ask a question that nobody has yet provided the answer to, and then do the original research that's necessary to answer that question. If that sounds like a tall order, it sure is. The work that you do is different in communication than it would be in hydrology or astronomy or especially theater. But what all master's theses have in common is that they are original research. They are usually the first major research project that the author has undertaken, and they have to be defended in front of a graduate committee of 3 professors. Now, we have met some master's students on this show before, or at least we've encountered their research. While most academic journal articles, and I mean like 90% of them, are written by professors with PhDs, but anybody can submit a paper to a journal, and it's a blind review process, which means the reviewers do not know who has submitted the article or what their qualifications are or what degrees they have. So I just love it when a master's student gets published, and I am always excited to talk to master's students about their research. It's just fun to see new people getting into the research biz, making important contributions, and sharing what it is they have learned. Now, we will get to Emily's research, but first, let's get to know her a bit. She grew up as a theater kid. Her dad was an actor. Her mom was a music director and an educator, so theater was kind of in the family. She currently works as an educator in theater, and she and I talked about how it was that she got there.
No, I'm actually a Pasadena native. I am from here, and I went to the LA County High School for the Arts, and then UC Santa Cruz for college. Yeah, banana slugs. Yes. So that was a great time. That's when I was doing a lot more of like the legit theater stuff. I was like doing Shakespeare, but I was the musical theater girl amongst all these like Shakespeare people. But that was a lot of fun.
And that was at Santa Cruz or
at Santa Cruz? Yeah, UC Santa Cruz. And then, then I lived in New York for just a couple years.
And how
did the whole New York in your 20s thing.
Yeah, so you'd finish your theater degree, I guess. You studied theater while you were at Santa Cruz.
I actually majored in history and I minored in theater.
Oh.
I actually grew up doing theater my whole life. Like my mom was a music director / educator, and my dad was an actor. So it was just like kind of a constant thing in my life. So college was like, I'm going to do something different. But history is always my other passion.
Yeah.
And along with like musical theater, which is kind of what brought me it kind of in my late 30s, early 40s to be like, I'm going to go to grad school. And so I went to, I'm nearing the end of my journey at Cal State Fullerton, where I kind of pitched them on, hey, can I do a musical theater history degree? And they said, yeah. So that's what I'm kind of putting those two worlds together. And so I do like theater as like my fun, well, it's my job with kids, but also like my fun like actor expression in my own life.
Well, that is a full bi-coastal experience. And here's something that I found fascinating. Emily actually favorably compares the theater scene in California to that in New York.
I just missed California. I just like it better. I just like living here. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. What about California appeals to you more than New York does?
Weather, my car, the landscape, the energy. I just like it better here. I'm just a California girl. I can't deny it. I love New York and I love going there, but like when it's cold, I'm like, I don't care for this. And one of the cool things about the LA area is that we have a pretty widespread theater scene, and varied. So there's a lot of different theater to see and to do. Way more than New York, I would argue. But that's just because this whole SoCal area is just like
all right.
So much bigger.
If you could talk about that a little more, I mean, because when you think musical theater, you immediately think Broadway, and then off-Broadway. Like those are two words that immediately have meaning. But what is it about California that you find has got more? I think varied is what you said. The theater scene in California. What is it that you find? What are the differences you see, and what is the value you see in the California scene?
Yeah, I think there was an article that I think it was the LA Times published maybe like a month ago of just going through every single community through regional theater in the Los Angeles area, and it was well over 50 companies. Yeah. There's again, I think it's varied because the LA area is just simply bigger. Broadway is like a few streets in Midtown Manhattan, and although there is theater in New York that is catered towards the more intimate, the more experimental, I think what people go to New York for is to see these big, flashy, money-making shows. Yeah. And I think right now I think it's like a really bad season for new musicals supposed to be right now, after a really good season. So it is kind of, I think there's like a come to Jesus moment needing to happen with New York musical theater right now, mostly because everything is based on an IP, everything costs too much, and blah 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 blah. But when it comes to LA theater, you can kind of
For those unfamiliar with the phrase IP, that stands
oh
for
intellectual property.
yeah,
So like yeah, like everything's based on a movie
yeah,
or a familiar name.
sure.
And plenty of
Well,
those shows start off with an LA run. They start off with something at like the La Jolla Playhouse or Center Theater
yeah,
Group. So that's not uncommon. I think you get more actors, at least in the theater game, who do it for the love of the game out here because um, I do theater with so many TV and film actors, and I'm not no one big, like people who get a gig or a commercial actor. Like you get a thing and you can ride the whole year out on that one paycheck. So then what do you do with your time? You go produce some theater or you do some theater just to
yeah.
keep your chops working. Um, and so I've worked with a lot of people like that, and they're some of like the best actors around because they're doing it because they love it. Um, but you can find big commercial theater out here. You can find little intimate weird shows. I mean, I think that's why the Hollywood Fringe is so exciting and Fringe festivals in general. Um,
Yeah.
but
I mean, I was struck by how enormous the Fringe is. Just the total number of shows that are like,
yeah.
and it's in the hundreds. And
Hmm.
what is always the first thing that struck me is that means there are literally hundreds and probably more people that are writing original theater that
Hmm.
want to have it produced and get it on a stage somewhere. And that's you know, you it's almost like where do they all come from? That's they're yeah.
Yeah, and it's grown. It's grown a lot. Like when I started doing it, um, we were kind of like the youngsters in the game, and now me and my like theater company were like the people who just like we're like it's our theater thing every year, so we look forward to doing it. But now there's a whole new crop of people coming up, and um a whole diversity of voices and audiences, and that is just so important to get, especially in theater.
Yeah.
um
And you
but
said you've got something going back this year. You've got another show.
we have a couple things in the works, but we're all in like the first read through stages, so
Yeah.
nothing really to write home about yet. But we might have a couple shows at the Fringe this year, and then who knows?
Okay, so then after discussing some musical theater history, we were reaching towards the master's thesis topic, and the gateway to the secret garden is.
Annie, oh, Annie's great.
And
How can you not like Annie?
do you find? I mean, do you find that politically significant, politically relevant? Is there, or what is it
Well,
like? I have always
Annie.
been, yeah,
No, so Annie is an interesting piece. Look, I love Annie. I've taught it about a million times, so if I don't see it every time, that's why, because I know that I've also been in Annie. I played Miss Hannigan in 2018, and my husband played Rooster, which was a lot of fun. God, that was so much fun. But yeah, I just got to scream at kids. It was great. But that show was written
middle
in the
school theater teacher therapy. You get to play a role where you get to
yeah,
yell at the
yeah.
kids, and
And they
that.
were all tweens, and there were so many little girls. There were so many of them. But uh what was I saying? Oh, it was written in the 70s as kind of a nostalgia piece because people in the 70s, you know, older people were looking back on the 20s and 30s going, wow, that was what a great time. I'm nostalgic for that time. So Annie was kind of written that way, and it's wildly optimistic for, you know, a show that takes place in the Great Depression. Um, but it's great. Like I think it's really I think it's a great show for kids, obviously, and it's really funny and a lot of fun. But like, you know, I think there's other like nostalgia bomb shows that maybe like I don't know
Well,
are more
I mean, it
political.
is a nostalgia bomb, but if you did not know like anything about FDR or the New Deal,
It's a
which
great introduction. That's why it's a
was,
great kid show.
yeah,
Yeah. You get to be
yeah,
like, here, tie this into your curriculum. It's great.
right. Well,
Yeah.
I do think there's something to be said, as we're witnessing things like Social Security come under threat and any social care program get called socialism, right? To be
Oh
able
yeah.
be able to give at least the performers and those audiences some context for, or some thought, right? These things all responded to a moment in time. And they
Yeah, I
were,
mean, at the end of the show, FDR literally says, "How about that? A new deal. Let's get a new deal." And then they all
yes.
sing "A New Deal for Christmas."
Yeah. Yeah, you
Oh,
can't
and
really
I
miss
like
that.
that. I like that song where they like tell Herbert Hoover to flip off. Like that's a pretty good one. I like that one.
Right. Anyway, it puts a little bit of history into a show that is, doesn't feel like it's beating you over the head with it, but is
Yeah.
definitely getting those ideas out to a much wider audience than you would get just from junior high school students reading history books. And
Well, and that's why seeing theater in general for kids is so important. It's just so important. You'll learn so much, and like just seeing live performances, it can be so inspiring because even just seeing the high school show, I always tell my kids to go see our high school shows because you can see it for cheap, and there's an aspirational thing there. You can go, well, that's going to be me in a few years.
all right, that's a pretty good fusion of musical theater and education, and that gets us up to the master's degree. Here is how Emily got going on that.
I guess working in like collegiate education would be great. I think that every one of the reasons why I picked Cal State Fullerton, I wanted to pick a Cal State because it was local, obviously, but I wanted to do Fullerton because you guys have a musical theater program.
Oh, yeah.
And so I thought, okay, well, I could do history anywhere, but if I could probably get into this Cal State that has like dedicated musical theater people in it, and musical theater library, musical theater resources, musical theater like classes. And so it ended up working out great. And I was a TA for a musical theater history class in the musical theater department. And it's just so important for musical theater performers to know their history. And they don't even have to know like really deep cut stuff. It's just like anything before the year 2000. Sometimes it's just like, they don't know. So I think, first of all, it would be probably easy to get some kind of collegiate, like in the musical theater or theater department, musical theater history class. But I also I took a cultural history class at Fullerton about jazz. I loved it, and it was like so helpful. And it wasn't even really about like, it wasn't jazz as like a music theory class. It was from a historical standpoint, even though we listened to and talked about jazz. And to me, like that would be really cool to teach musical theater history in like a more academic way, like geared towards historians or other academics, like a cultural
Right.
history. I'm sure that's been done somewhere, but if not, I'd like to kind of look into that. I don't know
Yeah,
what
well, hook me
how
up.
much people.
I'm on the curriculum committee at Cal State Fullerton.
Yeah, there you
Let's
go.
get
Yeah.
together and put the class together.
I'll pitch
There
it.
you go.
But something like that where because I love teaching it. I really do. I've done it in a few settings, like at a high school or like, I had a YouTube channel where I still have a YouTube channel where I did musical theater history videos, and I just love researching that stuff and talking about it. So if I could keep doing that, that would be ideal as my body starts to break away.
Improve with age.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, yeah. Okay. So what do you think the cultural importance of musical theater is? Like it is
It's
uniquely American,
it's
or
uniquely
it is
American. It
until
reflects.
freaking Andrew Lloyd Webber took it over for
Yeah,
the British.
well,
But
yeah, and then the mega musicals have their place. It's uniquely American. It at one time was the most important and popular medium ever in the 1920s. I think 1927 it was at its most like relevant, and then you get these milestone shows which would influence the world, whether through recordings or through film adaptations. So like Oklahoma's a great example. It's an important musical theater moment because it brought us the perfection of the integrated book musical, we would say. And then the movie version was super popular, and the cast album was like wildly successful and one of the first like cast albums. It was show tunes were popular music until rock and roll came around. That's kind of what top 40 was, like
yep.
the Great American Songbook, Tin Pan Alley, and songs from musicals. Musical theater kind of loses its relevance like in like the late 60s and comes back in the 70s and gets weirder with like concept musicals. And then the 80s, you know, you see that European influence, the mega musical, the Andrew Lloyd Webber, Les Mis and things like that. And now we're in this other era which really reflects what's going on here. It's like a bubble about to burst. It's like everything is so costs so much money to produce and to attend, and so you have to like hedge your bets and make sure it's going to be a hit, which is why there's so few risky new musicals on Broadway these days. But the pendulum tends to swing, so I have a feeling it'll swing back. And then you can just see it throughout pop culture in general. You know, Wicked is wildly popular. The movie adaptation, I think, is gonna. I think it's going to really change how we maybe adapt musicals, like cutting it into two parts, for better or worse.
All right, so we have now arrived at The Secret Garden. Here's a little backstory on that might make Emily's comments a little more interpretable. The Secret Garden is a children's book. It was written by a writer named Frances Hodges Burnett. Now, Burnett wrote more than 50 books and 13 or more plays. She was first published in 1877. But the story that really made her career take off was Little Lord Fauntleroy, which was published in 1886. And then The Secret Garden came out in 1911, so kind of after she was a very established author. The life story of Burnett is that she was born in England, and her father died of a stroke. After then several more downward economic spirals, her mom finally moved the family to a small town outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, from England to rural Tennessee. The plot of The Secret Garden, meanwhile, is that there is a 10-year-old girl named Mary living with wealthy parents in British India. The parents are distant. She is spoiled by the servants and isn't all that nice a human being. And then tragically, her parents die, and she is sent to live with her uncle, who is named Craven, in the Yorkshire moors. There she meets Craven's son, who's named Colin, and who's about her age. She discovers, as you might imagine from the title, a secret garden on the property, and the characters develop their relationships with one another and confront their challenges. It is the magic of the garden, like seriously Hogwarts-style magic, that helps turn things around for everybody. So one interesting characteristic of the story is that the first half of it is Mary's story, told from Mary's perspective, and the second half of the book shifts to being Colin's story, told from Colin's point of view. The book was massively successful, and it remains both beloved and very popular, according to Julaine Gillespie, writing for an outlet called The Lion and the Unicorn. Great journal name, by the way. As recently as 1996, the book, The Secret Garden, was still outselling Goodnight Moon, Charlotte's Web, and The Cat in the Hat. And there were actually 3 movie adaptations of that book, including a 1949 melodrama that Gillespie calls Hitchcock-esque, and a 1987 Hallmark movie before it arrives on Broadway. Okay, there's a scholar named Phyllis Bixler who's written quite a bit about the Broadway production and the development of the show. It turns out that the original idea to get it on Broadway came from a set designer named Heidi Landesman. Landesman shared her idea with Marcia Norman, who would eventually write the book for the show. They sent lyrics to 6 different composers and found that Lucy Simon had exactly what they wanted. Norman and Simon really hit it off. The show went through some development and extensive rewrites with runs at Skidmore College and Norfolk's Virginia Stage Company in 1989, and then the show hit Broadway in 1991, and the final piece of the puzzle was director Susan H. Schulman. Okay, so that's the timeline. Here were the choices that they made to get the show from that original book form to the Broadway version. First of all, they ditched that switch to Colin's story. This was going to be Mary's story, start to finish. Second, they wanted to portray the world of a child's dreams. That's a quote from Landesman that Bixler includes. And to do that, everything from the sets to the music to the lyrics and the plots were all designed to convey constantly a child's dreams. Third, and I can't believe I didn't know this before talking to Emily, they decided to base their show on ghosts. Marcia Norman read a biography of Burnett by an author named Anne Thwaite, who concluded that Burnett was a spiritualist, and hence the ghosts and the spirituality were an underlying possibility that Burnett had put in the text that Norman and Schulman and the whole creative camp, that by the way called themselves the Secret Garden Club, were going to just go out and explode on the stage. Martian Norman herself believed that, quote, the line between the living and the dead is very faint, end quote. Those are Bixler's words. And that by spiritualist, Norman meant someone who thought that people are watched over by spirits. Anyway, as the show goes on, the ghosts increasingly interact with and care for the living creatures. Magic and ghosts are central features of the story by the time it gets to Broadway. That Broadway run was very successful. It had kind of a confusing run with the Royal Shakespeare Company right around 2000. It continues to thrive to this day on school and university stages, and Emily Clark will fill us in on what's up with the Broadway revival. And I'm going to stop myself here because this is Emily Clark's thesis, which is sadly not about ghosts. Okay, but it is about women and how the female perspective shapes the show. Per Jelaine Gillespie, who I just mentioned, Burnett was a sort of 1900s feminist on the down low. I'll get to that a little more later, but it is undeniably the case that Burnett was a female author writing with a female perspective who developed very rich female characters. And the fact that the entire production team for the musical was female made the show very, very unique. Now, I will turn it over to Emily now, who's discussing the thesis of her thesis, and notice the impressive list of people that she has interviewed during the course of her research.
My thesis is on it's a history of the musical The Secret Garden, and it also digs into the history of women creatives on Broadway. So it's kind of mostly a history of The Secret Garden. I got oral histories with some of the people from the original cast. It came out in 91. And the reason I wrote about it, I guess I should mention this, is that it's the first Broadway musical where the creative team was primarily women. The composer, lyricist, book writer, director, and many, there were some others, were all women. And it's never been revived on Broadway, even though it's had a healthy life in community, regional, like it's been produced all the time, all around the world. And it tells a decidedly girly story, for lack of a better word, with a girl protagonist who is the orphan opposite of Annie. She is not sunshine and roses. She's a bit of a brat because she's been through trauma. And it's just, I wanted to write a history of it because it was rather brushed off at the time. It won a few Tonys, notably Daisy Egan is the youngest Tony Award winner ever. She won for supporting actress, even though she's the lead, but they were strategic about it. In an interesting year where kind of an old boys musical, the Will Rogers Follies, ended up winning everything, and nobody talks about the Will Rogers Follies anymore. So it kind of, I go into like the history of women on Broadway. It's not comprehensive because we would be here all day. There are plenty of really, really great resources and books all about women. There's women who write musicals or women who create musicals. So I kind of get into a brief history of it through the through the 70s, I think, and track it alongside feminism. And then I get into the 80s, which we call the Backlash era because of Susan Faluti's book, Backlash, against the feminism movement. And it was so great reading that because then I was looking at all these musicals I know from the 80s. And also there's a great historian named Stacey Wolf who wrote a book about feminism or feminist characters on Broadway. And you just see the parallels. Like these men hate women and they're just like writing shitty women in Broadway musicals and like, or they're just a lamp or like they're nothing, like they're a prop, like, and so it was so cool to track that and kind of see that same stuff kind of happening on Broadway, which, you know, despite what people might say, is actually like a fairly like masculine driven medium. The creatives are always men. And so then I kind of go into the entire history of The Secret Garden going to Broadway. So I pulled from interviews. Some of the people who are involved with it are deceased. Lucy Simon wrote the music. There are very few women composers on Broadway, even to this day. Also interviews with Marcia Norman, who wrote the book and lyrics. I dig interview Heidi Ettinger, who was the producer slash set designer of the show, who kind of conceived the project with the Jew Jamson Theater Company. And I talked to the director, Susan Schulman, and I talked to two of the actors. I talked to Daisy Egan, and I talked to Allison Frazier, who played Martha the maid. Couldn't get Mandy Patinkin, but maybe in a later draft. And so, yeah, it really is kind of looking at this one show and kind of what came before it and how it's influenced other women creatives and where it falls in Broadway history. That was a long answer, but yeah.
Oh no, that's I mean, it's a thesis, right? There are no short answers.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, right. Yeah, totally.
Okay, and what is your I guess what is your conclusion about the show? Why is it a significant what is the historical? It is obviously epical turning point for women in Broadway and in musical theater from the creative side, but I mean, does it have a legacy? Does it demonstrate what does that show demonstrate to you?
Yeah, it has a wonderful legacy, but one that has like never made its way back to Broadway, which I find interesting.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is?
Well, I saw a production of it at Center Theater Group a couple years ago that they were debating bringing to Broadway, and it was terrible. And Daisy Egan said when I interviewed her, she said men should just not direct this show. I think they're just not getting it, and I think it's hard to find people with the right vision for this show. It gets reading the reviews for it are fascinating because like they're so mixed, and then sometimes it's always like taking a dig at like a different woman on the creative team, and there's like no consensus as to like who gets the blame. The best review or the people who got it were mostly women reviewers, but especially a woman from the New Yorker, I remember. Anyway, I'm going on a tangent. It's just, you see the legacy in the women who came after writing musicals, who were either mentored by them or the women on the team who continued to write shows. Marsha Norman is probably the most prolific. But there are also one of our most important and only woman composers, Janine Tesori, got her start like as an assistant arranger on the show, and she's multiple Tony Award winner, again like one of our only women composers on Broadway working now. So you see them kind of like coming out of the ashes that were the 80s to create this like sentimental show, also one that corrects the injustices of the original text. I reread The Secret Garden for this, obviously the novel, and like the shift of the novel just goes from Mary, the assumed protagonist, to her like weekly cousin Colin halfway through the book, and then it's like Colin's story, which is really weird. And so the musical keeps it with her and keeps it with honoring the perspective of a 10-year-old girl in a Broadway musical. And in a world before Wicked and before Disney on Broadway, in this era coming out of the 80s where everything was dirty and grimy and like sexy and Bob Fosse, it just kind of stands out. I did go to, it's almost 2 years ago now, I went to New York to watch the Pro Shot at the New York Public Library. They have every Broadway musical ever you could watch at the New York Public Library. You just gotta like request it and go there, and you gotta put your phone in your bag and put some headphones on and you can watch it. And it was amazing to watch because you see these moments coming in from intermission, and you would just see the audience was just all women, just 90% women, and theater goers are almost always women. But like, there were so many like jokes at the time of like, oh, they got to drag their husbands because their husbands are so bored. And it's just that kind of consistent devaluing of art made for women. And it really wasn't appreciated in its time. And nowadays, I still don't know why it doesn't have a Broadway revival, but it's one of the most widely produced shows in the country. Community theaters do it because there's like a part for every actor. There's like a belter girl, there's a soprano lady, there's like an old man part, like there's a little boy, like there's a teenage tenor part. There's like a part for everyone in your community theater or your educational theater program. Like opera companies do it because some of the music, the soprano parts like get so high and are so beautiful and lush. There were oh, I'm sure there's more. Heidi, the set designer, like learned, like they came up with a whole new method of like photo printing set pieces, like some of the first like major big scale like photo printed set design, because they wanted it to look like those little like scrapbook designs from like the Victorian era. So it has a lot of like little angel babies and like flowers and things like that. I'm sure I mean, there's so much more. Like the Tony Awards that year, it was, you know, The Secret Garden was in the mix, and they won for, I think Daisy Egan won. I think they won for Best Book. Heidi Ettinger won for her set design. Maybe there was something else, I can't remember. If I had my thing, I would look at it. But there was another show that was really underappreciated that same year, which is called Once on This Island, which has a very similar trajectory. The only difference is Once on This Island was about a black girl, was about a primarily black cast, but it was also written and directed by women, and it didn't even win any Tony Awards. But just like Secret Garden, it's widely produced throughout the country all the time, especially in educational theater. So it's like feminism and Broadway history. It's like it all culminates in this like one show in the early 90s. And like, just like I was saying, like you see the culture reflected in these shows and the way, and I kind of see that in this show. I see like early 90s, what it is to be a woman trying to just make it in the early 90s. And when I talk to like Heidi Ettinger, I asked her, like, do you think this is a feminist piece? She's like, no. I don't know. Maybe you think it's feminist. I just wanted to do a good show. And then I talked to the director, and she's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's feminist because I wrote it. And then Daisy Egan was like, flip the table over going, of course it's feminist. It's the most feminist thing ever. So like, even all these women kind of different stages in their lives don't even really view it the same way.
Yeah.
I think it's feminist, but.
Well, that says something about the nature of, I don't know, feminism and gender relations, right? That sometimes just the ability of women to be women,
yeah,
seems revolutionary, or stands out as not as something you have to fight just to be able to get on the stage.
Or telling stories geared towards women, you know, like for example, like Les Mis is just such like a manly show. All the men get to just like man it up, and every girl just stands alone in a spotlight, isolated from everyone else when she sings her big solo. The one time a woman gets to kind of connect is when she's dying. Like in Phantom of the Opera, Christine has her I Want song isn't even an I Want song. It's a song she's auditioning. So we don't even know what she wants. So this was like really common leading up to it. And it just felt, especially if you read some of the reviews, it just has that feeling of like, who do you guys think you are? Like, who do you little ladies think you are doing this? And Susan Schulman, the director, she said a few times, she said it with me and she said it in interviews, but like when people would ask her, like, does your gender affect your role as a director? And she's like, I assume my gender affects everything I do. I mean, I just, what do you mean? Like, how do I pull that away from who I am? So.
Yeah. Well, we are now 30 years later. How do you view the current moment for women in musical theater? Is it like,
well, there's more ladies who write musicals, that's for sure. There absolutely are. There's more women in more roles behind the scenes. Some are still dominated by men. For example, even in the early days of Broadway, like we were more allowed to like let women be lyricists or librettists, because to compose music is so, you have to be a genius to do that. And so you've got to be a man, you know, it's this lofty profession. If you're a woman who plays the piano, you're the rehearsal pianist, you know? but you could write stuff. You can write like a poem, or you can write lyrics, or like we allow women in behind the scenes roles that are gendered as feminine. So like a costume designer, but even choreographers, even like the choreographic auteurs are always men. It's Fosse, it's Jerome Robbins. We don't look at Agnes DeMille quite the same way because she didn't have as many hits, but she was the same. um yeah. So nowadays there's definitely more women in more creative roles on Broadway. We've often had lots of great big wonderful roles for women on stage, like that's for sure. What the stories being told really depend on the era and depend on the times. Again, Stacey Wolf's book is great for this, but nowadays, I mean, Broadway is it's not it's more just like our original stories even happening on Broadway anymore. And I don't know if they really are. But yeah, there's definitely more stuff for women. But the musical that got the official all women first all women creative team was
80s.
Waitress.
Oh yeah.
It was Waitress, and that came out in like 2015. So it took from The Secret Garden to Waitress to get like, because Secret Garden, the choreographer was a guy. Waitress had the first all women creative team in every major role, and that's a 2-decade difference.
That was where our conversation ended. It was awesome. The show was a major turning point for Broadway and U.S. cultural generally. Emily is doing a deep dive with original interviews to write a more thorough history of that production than exists anywhere now, and you can get a copy of that finished thesis just as soon as she defends it for her committee this coming spring. One thing I'll tack on is that there is definitely something about a female lens that is the key to the show. There's been some discussion about how the show needs a female vision to succeed, and one consequence has been that male directors, male audiences, male reviewers often don't quite get it. And that sort of resonated with my own quick review of the reviews, if you will. Jack Kroll, a notably male reviewer, commented on the 1991 show, and he basically trashed it. He started with a comment that it cost about $6.2 million to produce, which was a ton of money at the time, but, quote, you can't buy magic, and magic is what an adaptation of Frances Hodgson Burnett's classic novel must have, end quote. You will not be surprised to hear that he doesn't really find any magic in the show. His review ends, quote, this is really two shows, a touching setting of a classic fable, overlaid with a stifling sophistication that turns an enchanting garden into a Broadway hothouse. There's a clear emphasis there on the word stifling. He does not like it. In contrast, in 2019, female critic Julia York Coppens reviewed a Chicago version of the show, and she loved it. She noted that many of the people who were in attendance, even the high school males, she saw it while a bunch of high schoolers were had gotten tickets for it. They were moved to tears, and says that the show is a bucket list production for many accomplished actors. That is, there are some really good actors who feel that being part of the production will be a special challenge and thrill. Anyway, one last piece of evidence that the show does indeed have relevance to the overall cause of females is that if gender is a lifetime of looking at issues in certain ways, that vision of what you might call the feminine gaze is apparent in the show. To me, that makes it significant. And if you're a dude, give it a shot. You might just find yourself as moved as the high school students that Julie Coppens saw fighting back tears. Okay, I am now going to shift away from Emily's main focus, which is the important question of gender, and take one side quest here to look back at my own favorite topic. There is an article, actually a New York Times story, actually a New York Times interview from October 12th of 1913, which ran with this title, Mrs. Burnett and the Occult. The noted novelist explains some of her beliefs and opinions on the other world matters, end quote. And not just that, a separate New York Times interview in 1906 talked with Burnett about her book, The Dawn of Tomorrow, and asked point blank, is it theosophy? Julie Coppins, in her review of the 2015 show, points out that Burnett was into spiritualism, and that's a term with a very particular meaning. In 1986, Gillian Adams wrote a chapter on The Secret Garden, started with a quote from Carl Jung about psychic poison, and writes about how the supernatural is central to the entire plot of The Secret Garden, with extensive quotes from the text itself, especially where Colin explicitly identifies magic as the force that lets him know that he'll survive and gives him the courage to enter adulthood. There is magic in the show, and there's the suspicion that its author was involved in the occult. Now, we have touched on these topics before. In our 5th episode on cats, we talked about T.S. Eliot and the occult. And right in that 1900 to 1930 window, there was a bent of religion was facing a major disruption from science. Human words were being carried on the radio. People could talk, and invisibly their words would be carried huge distances, which seemed like magic. Humans were achieving air flight for the first time, and it seemed like science could very well have something to say about the spiritual world. If it was possible to transmit the human voice through the ether, or say discover that there was a thing like an atom that literally the whole universe was built on, wasn't it possible for science to discover something definitive about the afterlife that had not been discovered before? Now, there were very specific schools of thought on that, and very specific words and names identified those different schools of thought. There were the spiritualists, who believed that the human soul survived physical death, and psychical researchers who believed that they were objectively gathering information about a possible spirit world, and a third branch called the Theosophists, strongly associated with a leader named Madame Blavatsky, who disapproved of seances. And then there were splits. The psychical researchers and the Theosophists eventually fell out when the psychical researchers exposed some fraudulent claims by Blavatsky, and the footnotes, all that stuff are in that 5th episode of Cats. So when the New York Times was asking Burnett about spiritualism or theosophy, they were asking her about specific beliefs and what her specific ideas about the afterworld were, and whether and how humans could get in touch with the spirits, and whether or not she fell into any of those camps. Now, for his part, T.S. Eliot, the other author who had a journal article called T.S. Eliot and the Occult, in the same way, this was Mrs. Burnett and the Occult. T.S. Eliot, the other guy who had something to do with the occult, was pretty knee-deep in some of the darkest parts of it. The themes are pretty front and center in his most famous poem, which is called The Wasteland. The poem itself has some pretty specific occult references, and there are those who have suggested that it might have been produced by automatic. The poem itself, his most famous poem, the poem that made T.S. Eliot, and by some accounts just kind of launched the entire modernist era in literature, that poem had been produced by automatic writing, a process where a spirit inhabits a human and guides their hands to produce the text. Eliot himself described writing as being like a case of demon possession, where a story or a poem inhabited the author and demanded an exit from their body into the world. And in fact, Burnett would say some very similar things about her own experience with writing, that it almost felt like she was not the one creating it, that there was some other entity that was driving it out of her. Anyway, Eliot attended seances by the noted supernatural enthusiast Lady Rothermore, which included, among other things, naked dancing. He had a tight and unusual ties to a noted occultist named A.R. Orage, O-R-A-G-E. In particular, at one point, Eliot had become a literary superstar, but he decided to dedicate space in his literary journal to write an obituary for Orage, which was weird. Why did this literary journal, which normally didn't publish obituaries at all, publish one written by Eliot about a really relatively obscure occultist? I mean, way to make a point of honoring the deceased, but why do it for Orage and only Orage if there isn't a pretty close connection between that occultist and Eliot? And what was Burnett's reaction to these very similar questions from the New York Times? Eliot kind of leaned into the dark side of it. What did Burnett do? Well, pretty much the exact opposite of T.S. Eliot. Eliot was a dark and broody guy who seemed unhappy most or all of the time. Burnett on the other hand, was by all accounts a bubbly optimist with a cheery outlook, and not just by disposition, but kind of as a life philosophy. Like, she believed you could make the world a better place by putting happiness into it. The interview, that New York Times interview, actually ends with a question of whether or not she is an optimist, and she responds by saying, always an optimist, and says it with a smile, and all that's in that article. The interview actually started with the question, does the supernatural influence direct human endeavor? Now, that is a very 1913 way of phrasing the question, isn't it? But her answer is pretty straightforward. She says, quote, frankly, I do not know, nor am I willing to be one of those pompous individuals who form an opinion upon one of the most unanswerable questions and state it as infallible truth, end quote. I like Frances Hodges Burnett. Now, she does talk a lot about atoms in the New York Times interview and elsewhere. Quote, then may the learned ones, being with the atom and follow the steps of evolution, I'm going to do that quote again. Quote, then may the learned ones begin with the atom and follow the steps of evolution up to the highest state of civilized man. They may know volumes more about what occurs between the appearance of the atom and its development into a highly cultured human creatures, yet they know no more than we about the mystery of life that creates the atom, end quote. She is using the atom as evidence of how much science might uncover that seemed incomprehensible even just years earlier before she had written that, and keeping an open mind about how much mystery and spiritual energy still remains even when you crack the code of the atom. Listen to this quote. Quote, consider too the wonderful invention of late years, the harnessing of the great force of electricity, the determined effort of man to conquer the air, end quote. She's thinking about the possibility of what might happen, and doggedly keeping an open mind, the interviewer tries to get her to name a faith, and she denies being a Christian scientist, an advocate of New Thought, a disciple of a yogi, a Buddhist, or a Confucian, or a Theosophist. She is, on the other hand, curious and open to the spiritual world. What I like about her the most is that what she really hates is a dogmatist, and that I just think is a great approach to the idea, spirituality. We've talked on the show that most people do believe in a spiritual world of at least some sort. Like there is a general belief that there is, we exist beyond this, but getting from that to like the hardcore fundamentalist religious thoughts across all denominations and all different creeds, that is really a way to set the world back. And I do think that Burnett's approach, yes, there could be something out there, but what I know the most is that I don't know what it is, and what I don't trust is somebody else who's going to tell me they do know what it is. And I think she had a point that usually when those people who believe in absolute truth are especially susceptible to thinking that they know what it is, and then using that to make other people's lives miserable. And Burnett, if anything, was not miserable. Anyway, so T.S. Eliot is going into the cult, and as a definitely dark guy, maybe the original Harvard emo guy, found some dark stuff. And Frances Hodges Burnett went in and found infinite possibility, mystery, and optimism. And isn't it absolutely fascinating that these two authors, whose work and personalities could not have been more different, who lived and wrote at almost the exact same time, both had their stuff turned into Broadway musicals? And isn't it absolutely amazing that it was Eliot, the deep psychological realist, who had his stuff turned into Cats, the most whimsical of all shows that has never been accused of being too deep, and that Burnett, the advocate of happiness who wrote children's book, had her stuff turned into a musical that has some really deep psychological stuff. Director Marcia Milgram Dodge, who did that Chicago production, called it a, quote, complicated little monster. And Julie Coppins noted, quote, all the Secret Garden characters have tricky psychologies, end quote. You might even say that the stage production is a psychological thriller. That is where most of the drama and the dramatic tension come from. If there is one thing that I take from all this, it is that it is truly all connected, and that chaos is the organizing force of the universe. I think It proves that you can find some profound truths in playful places like children's books about magics and birds and gardens, and you can find some lighthearted fun even in the deepest, darkest places, like the deepest, darkest place of modernity, which I think is the mind of T.S. Eliot. And I will just end by saying that Eliot's life had more than a little bit of tragedy in it, but not more than Burnett's. Burnett lost her dad at a young age and then got tossed from England across the Atlantic Ocean to rural Tennessee when she was just a tween. And instead of spiraling down, by the age of 18, she was a publishing author and doing her darndest to put some fun, whimsy, optimism, and happiness in the world. I'm scoring that as Burnett 1, Eliot -5. And with apologies to Andrew Lloyd Webber fans out there, I think that maybe the Secret Garden musical has a little more to say about life and the meaning of everything than Cats does. Well, that will do it for us. Emily is set to finish her thesis in the spring of 2026, and when she does so, it's going to go on the shelves of the Cal State Library no later than this fall, the Fullerton Library, that is. And since Cal State Fullerton is a public library, anybody can give it a read or check it out or probably access it digitally through some system that I don't yet fully grasp. But if you get a chance and are interested in one of the seminal female-generated shows in Broadway history, go ahead and check it out. Grab that thesis, give it a read, see what she has uncovered, and I am certain it's going to be fascinating. Our next episode is only a week away. We will get into the ghosts of Founding Father, early capitalist, founder of the U.S. Treasury, and reimagined hip-hop star Alexander Hamilton on our next episode Theater History.